My name is John Fultz. I do a bunch of stuff with the Wolfram language front end, and I am basically giving kind of a survey talk of which I do these most years. There you go. So I'm giving kind of a survey talk of what we've been working on the past year, what you can expect to see coming up soon and such. And I had a bit more difficulty with this talk than with some of the other talks, and it took me a while to figure out what the problem was when I was trying to come up with material for the talk. And I finally figured out one of the problems is version 12. It's a big round number, and you expect sweeping changes in big round numbers, and there are sweeping changes going on within the front end, but a lot of them are only kind of partially peeking out through version 12, and they represent there's stuff that's going on in there that's definitely good stuff, but they represent part of a bigger picture. And I don't like to dig too deep into stuff that's beyond the next release because, as a general principle, I think it's not useful to look too far ahead. But in this case, it helps me tell the story. So I'm going to talk about some stuff that you're going to see in version 12, and then kind of place that in a framework of some other stuff that we're doing. So let's go ahead and get started. The first and biggest thing, platform supports. Stephen, of course, announced this. The big news is for the Mac people in the room that we have a 64-bit Mac front end. So yeah, it was hard, and I could tell you war stories. That's not what I'm going to do now. What I'm going to do now is I will talk a little bit about the front end. There's some stuff that's pretty simple. I mean, in many ways, it's going to look like what you're using now, except 64-bit. And that's kind of the intention. But there are a few things to call out here, and I'd like to go ahead and do so. So what are the implications of moving from 32-bit to 64-bit? Well, it's interesting because one of the questions that I've often gotten, both with this project and with other projects that we've done where we've moved to 32-bit to 64-bit is it faster? And that's a tough question to answer in the abstract about, arbitrary software because you get some advantages from going to 64-bit. Often, you'll get wider registers and more registers on the CPU. You may have, more data going over the bus. That looks good. But then you're also throwing around more memory a lot of times. Inside the code, it's throwing around integers which represent offsets in memory, and your offsets grew by a factor of 2 in their length. And some programs, and ours is one of them, do that a lot. And so you can see memory growth, and with memory growth, you can end up then blowing caches, and that can lead to a detriment in performance. So I was a bit surprised when I looked into what was done for what we've done for the Cocoa 64-bit front end, and discovered that it seems to be faster across the board. It's very pleasant, actually. And doing various sorts of operations, I saw result times for pushing the front end to do either hard things or repetitive things. I saw result times when compared to 11.3, the 11.3 32-bit front end of, I think the worst that I saw was, a result time of 75% of what 11.3 did, and the best was 40%. So it depends on what you're doing. In fact, I kind of doubted this at first and So then I went over to my Windows machine and I tried 11.3 versus 12, and all the same operations that I just done on my Mac. And the times were so close as to not be, sufficiently different. So as much as I'd like to say it was because we did brilliant optimizations across the board in version 12, it turns out that that for whatever reason, I could speculate, I don't know 100% for certain, but it may have to do with the implementation of the operating system GUI calls in Mac OS, or there may be some virtualization effect going on when you're thunking from 32 to 64-bit or something. I don't know, but in any case, it's faster, and it's noticeably faster. I mean, most of the time the front end is pretty responsive, but you put a timer on it, you're definitely going to see it. So that's great. Well, one thing that's a little less great, actually, what's great is that memory exhaustion crashes are a thing of the past. And this is something when we get a Mac OS specific bug report that may be filed internally or externally, some decent fraction of them, I don't know, maybe something like 5% of them in the end turned out to be someone who just blew the limit of what their 32-bit process could address. And there wasn't much that we could hope to do within 32 bits except maybe try to reduce the amount of memory that was being used. And in fact, we didn't even necessarily have a straight, I forget whether Mac OS is 2 or 3 gigs, but we didn't even have a straight that amount of memory to deal with, because when you're that limited, you're dealing with fragmentation as well, which can eat you alive. So that's a thing of the past. I'm not going to go on record and say that 2 to the 40 bytes is enough for any computer in the future, but it should work for a while, though, I think. But one disadvantage, and it's to be expected, and I just talked about this, is increased memory usage. And that's something that, if you're looking at an activity monitor, you'll notice that pretty quickly. So, but overall, it's pretty good. I'll just mention a couple of the other issues. So, of course, the principal way that people notice this these days is getting the not optimized warning from your Mac OS. And unfortunately, we could not make that warning go completely away for version 12. And that doesn't have to do with front end. It has to do with the fact that Mac OS is very aggressive about going through the entire app bundle looking for 32-bit processes. And we had one process that just lagged behind the others in terms of what we were developing. We couldn't pull it out because it has some critical stuff in it. But we have a plan to deal with it, and I don't know, I'm hoping that we'll be able to deliver it well before whatever the next major release is. I'm hoping we'll be able to deliver it as part of an incremental release after a very tiny incremental release after version 12. So there were some small interface changes. And most of them you won't notice, but we're moving towards being more what one might expect from a native macOS application. The most surprising one I will just call out, which is, there we go. There we go. Okay. And this is kind of small. I'm sorry, you may not be able to see it very well. But the magnification widget moved. It is now here in the upper right-hand corner instead of along the bottom. And that's because we're moving towards this Mac OS ideal of borderless windows. You don't really have a scroll bar until it just pops up out of nowhere, that sort of thing. that's probably the most surprising thing. Other things are maybe noticeable, but will generally be subtle. So yeah, that's good. And so we're still going to be adding stuff even after version 12. I mean, we have something that works, but we're a bit behind in terms of catching up with some of the macOS features that we couldn't do. We simply couldn't do until we moved to 64-bit land. Like, for example, supporting gestures from your touchpad, or being able to respond properly to dark mode messages, which a lot of people have been asking about as far as Mojave is concerned. And I'll mention, by the way, we have good solutions for something that looks like a good dark mode, but it's not something right now that ties into the operating system as operating system aware yet. On our list of stuff to do. So that's what we have for version 12. But a lot of people have been asking about high DPI support, and Windows, and to a lesser extent Linux, but especially the Windows folks would like to see something that supports the modern scaling resolution that you see in Windows 10. And the good news is, and I'm not going to say anything here that we're not actually working on, that I couldn't, if pressed, pull out a development version and show you. Not going to do that this talk, but take my word for it. I could pull out a development version of Windows high DPI support and show you, and this is our next highest priority. So I would expect, and it's a lot of work. It's more work than you might think, but it is definitely coming, and as fast as we can make it happen. So we know that people are very interested. Okay, so moving on from platforms. Stephen talked a little bit about notebook deployments. I'm just going to reiterate some of the things he said, go into a bit more detail. So one of the big news is that we're retiring FreeCDF. And when I say retire, I don't mean deprecate. You still, you have things that were saved as FreeCDF. Everything works just fine. So it's not deprecated in that sense. But we're retiring it because it's not going to be necessary anymore. Because the role that we had reserved for FreeCDF is going to be reserved for regular notebooks. And in that context, we're also looking at notebook deployment, because CDF was a lot about deployment. And so we're looking at alternative stuff for deployment as well. And let me just go into a bit of detail then on these points. So what was FreeCDF trying to accomplish? Well, one thing was it supported our web browser plugin. And it was difficult to have kind of an arbitrary notebook with arbitrary settings function well inside of a web browser plugin. Well, web browser plugins died. And so that's just not an option anymore. We pulled it from the product. And so I think we pulled it in 11.3, I think, finally, after almost every browser had pulled it out. And Safari, I think, was the last one to pull it out just a few months ago. So that was one sort of issue that we were dealing with. And then we were also, I don't know, I was never a huge fan of this, having lots of deployment options, but we had some concerns about what you can open in Player and having it be secure, ensured that you've created a file that you've made with our product. Well, those concerns, in this light have basically gone away. So any regular old notebook, you want to open it in Player, you will get exactly the same functionality that you got before from FreeCDF. And there is still a thing called CDF, which is Enterprise CDF. If you have an Enterprise version, it gives you a few extra benefits. I won't go into that. Andre has a talk, which I had on it'll come up on the next slide again. Andre has a talk talking about that. But it's still a little more confusion than I would like, but we're simplifying. I love simple. Publishing a notebook. So we now have a menu item, and it is really easy to use. You just have to be logged in, and if you're logged in, then it is just so easy. And so if you want to, let's just make ourselves a notebook real quick, and I'm not even going to save this because it's not even necessary to save it. And sorry about the tiny scaling here. Oh, it's tinier on my screen than up here. But so we now have publish to cloud, brings up a dialog box. And the dialog box gives you a few options. You want to send it to anyone or just a few people. I don't think it's really, it's, tends to be more interesting for me if you show it to everyone, but whatever. But then another set of options is a set of options up at the top, specify a name or automatically assign a URL. What's that about? Well, the workflow here that I think works best is if you're just doing one-off things. You're just throwing something out there once, you don't really care about it, you're not going to look at it again, then just automatically assign a name. But if you're going to throw something out there that you want to update, a document that maybe you make some edits to or updates to and then post it again and again, then assign a name, and then you can keep publishing to the same name. So in this case, I don't care about the name, so I'm just going to publish, and it's going to tell me what URL it went to, so I'll copy that and paste it in, and there we go, easy peasy. So that is one way to just make it really easy to be able to share your stuff with the world. And then now Windows users may recognize this because we've had a send to option in Windows for a while, but it used an older Windows technology, which is kind of atrophied. Not as many people use it, especially if you're using webmail, it didn't really work for you. But now we have an easy path. It doesn't, you can configure it to use your mail server if you want, but not necessary, because if you just log into the cloud, we provided all that stuff for you. And that is pretty much the same thing here. I can just take the same notebook and, there we go. Just take that same notebook and send to, and I'll just send it to myself. And then just go ahead and hit send. Once again, super simple. I have done no configuration on my computer. I mean, I do use mail.app, but I didn't configure this to use mail.app. It's just going through the cloud. All I did was log in. And sure enough, if we look at my email, there we go. There's my little thing that I sent. And it nicely deals with things like, what if you send a large notebook that's not going to work well as an attachment? It will just auto set it up as a cloud document and then send the link instead. And most of the time, you don't even have to think about it. So that's what we're doing now. I forgot to mention Andre's talk, which was on the previous slide. There we go. Andre's talk, Friday, 9:30. What we're doing later that's kind of interesting, not for version 12, but coming, I hope, soon thereafter, is the ability to deploy notebooks through Wolfram script. If you want a script that just that includes a notebook or a series of notebooks as part of a package, but you want it in a single file, that's something that will have a tool that you can basically package up a whole series of things in a single Wolfram script. Have it be something that can be shared as a single file, but be launched as if you have a little layout that includes notebooks or whatever. So graphics. I'm not going to dwell too long on this because Yutsu Liu is giving a talk at 10:30 tomorrow. I just did want to mention a few things though. And yeah, I just have a few minutes left, so I'm going to speed through this a bit, but you get the idea. First of all, we have polygons with holes, and this is a specification. It's fairly straightforward. So we have a polygon. In this case, I have just a standard triangle, and I'm cutting a square hole into it. And we're using this rule notation here too. I just have the bitmap here just to make it clear that there is an actual transparent hole in here. So you can see that. So that's fairly straightforward. It works in 3D as well. And it really works with, you know, with everything. You want to do vertex colors, textures, custom lighting, whatever, you know, face form, whatever, fully integrated. And it does crazy stuff with, you know, I'm showing simple convex polygons here, but you want weird concave self-intersecting polygons. Everything just works. So also with graphics, we have a new faster method of rendering transparency. Rendering transparency is always an issue for us because it's hard. It's just algorithmically hard. There's no way around that. But people ship new hardware, and people write research papers. And about, I don't know, about every 3 years or so, Yutsu comes up to me and says, "There's a brand new method for doing transparency. Can I implement it?" And so that's what happened. You know, the last time it was depth peeling. This time it's single pass depth sorting. Which actually Yutsu and James Lane, who isn't here, worked on that. And that works right now. It's only implemented under OpenGL, and unfortunately, only under modern OpenGL. Turns out that macOS OpenGL is not modern anymore, which speaks to what's coming. We're implementing Direct3D for Windows for the single pass depth sorting. And we're implementing Metal. We're seeing the writing on the wall, and OpenGL, you know, is not the future that Apple wants. It's a pain in the butt because it's more work for us, but there we go. We're working on Metal, and we've made quite a bit of progress there. Also, we have some faster 2D stuff coming up. And then one more thing, and then I have a few smaller things I may have to skip, but one more thing. That I just want to mention, we have the beginnings of full Unicode support, and it kind of looks something like this. So now you can have your emojis. I know that this is probably the single most important feature. And now it's not 100% baked for version 12, but what is baked is, you know, there's not going to be any file corruption. There's not going to be any issue with computation or round tripping, but it's not fully integrated into the editor yet. So there's some glitchiness around editing it. Copy and paste might be a bit of an issue, but there's a lot of stuff that does work here. I just wanted to point out that this required a new form for inserting arbitrary Unicode. You may be aware of the, you know, the \:: form, you know, where you can do something like that, and that's apparently not a character. How about that? There we go. I don't know what that is. There we go. So we now have a new form, which is \:pipe. So \:pipe 01 F4 600. There we go. Or if you want to do Sanskrit, if I can remember it, 01 24. Nope. Pipe 01240 or something like 1 or something. Yeah. So that's a Sanskrit for I don't know. So I'm kind of out of time, but I will just call out really quickly. We've done some interesting stuff with presenter tools. I'm using it right now. And some of the stuff that we did benefits all dynamic interfaces. You want to find out more about that, come talk to me. We're working on table view. It is not finished yet, but it is better in version 12 than it's ever been, and it's really close to being finished. Still undocumented, but please try it out if you're interested. Attached cells, there's a talk tomorrow. Jason Abernathy is giving. We're building all kinds of our modern interfaces around it. And Wolfram Alpha Notebooks, that's the next talk, so I'm not going to spoil it. So lots of good stuff going on. If you have any questions, probably need to step out, but thank you very much.